She grabbed my arm in the middle of a crowded school hallway, her eyes wide with panic, and asked me something I never expected to hear from a complete stranger. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you just pretend to be my boyfriend for one day? Just today. I'm begging you." I looked at her, this beautiful, clearly distressed woman I had never met in my life, and in that moment I had every reason to say no. I was a single father. I was exhausted. I had a board meeting the next morning that could determine the fate of 140 employees, and I had absolutely zero business getting tangled up in someone else's personal drama. But there was something in her eyes. Something desperate and honest and real. And against every logical instinct I had, I said yes. Now, before I tell you everything that happened next, I need you to tell me something. Was I wrong for letting this go as far as it did? Because by the end of this story, there's going to be a moment where you either completely understand every decision I made, or you're going to think I lost my mind entirely. Either way, stay with me, because this is one of those stories that I genuinely could not have written myself. My name is Daniel, and at the time this happened, I was 41 years old, the sole parent of a 9-year-old boy named Marcus, and the CEO of a mid-sized logistics and supply chain company that I had spent 14 years building from a 2-person operation out of my apartment into a firm with offices in 4 cities. I say that not to brag. I say it because it matters for the story. You see, I had made a very deliberate choice years earlier to keep my professional life almost completely separate from my personal life. I didn't have a publicist. I didn't do magazine profiles. I didn't post on social media. The people in my professional world knew exactly who I was. But in Marcus's school, in our neighborhood, at the Saturday farmers market, where we bought our tomatoes, I was just Daniel, the single dad. The guy who showed up to pick up in the same worn gray hoodie every week, usually with paint on his hands because Marcus had decided we were doing an art project again. And honestly, I loved it. After 14 years of boardrooms and negotiations and being Mr. Hargrove or Sir to everyone around me, being just Daniel felt like breathing fresh air. So when this happened, when this woman grabbed my arm in the hallway of my son's school, she had no idea who I was. She just saw a tall guy in a gray hoodie who looked like he might be kind enough not to immediately walk away. Her name was Claire, and I would come to learn that she was the mother of a little girl in Marcus's class named Lily. I had seen Claire before, I realize now in retrospect, in the blur of faces at pickup and drop-off, the school fundraiser last fall, maybe one of the assemblies, but we had never actually spoken. She was stunning in a completely unassuming way, dark curly hair pulled back in a messy knot, wearing a blazer over a striped shirt like she had come straight from work, which I later found out she had, and she was visibly shaken. Her hands were actually trembling. I noticed that immediately. "I'm so sorry," she said, still gripping my arm, scanning the hallway like she was looking for someone. "I know this is insane, I know. I need help, and I need it right now, and you have a kind face. I want to pause here and tell you that in my experience, very few adults say things like 'you have a kind face,' unless they are genuinely, legitimately desperate. So instead of pulling my arm away and politely excusing myself like any sensible person would have, I stopped walking, and I said, 'Okay, tell me what's happening.' What she told me came out in fragments, hushed and hurried, because we could already see the children starting to come out of the classrooms down the hall. Her ex-boyfriend, a man named Preston, who she had dated for about 8 months and broken up with 3 months prior, had apparently shown up at the school. He wasn't a parent. He had no business being there. But he had told the front office he was there to pick up Lily, and because Claire had, in a moment of terrible judgment early in their relationship, added him to Lily's approved contact list, and then forgotten to remove him after the breakup, the office had technically let him wait in the hallway. Claire had gotten a call from the school secretary 30 minutes ago, and had rushed over from her office across town. She said Preston was obsessive, that he had been texting and calling constantly since the breakup, that he had shown up at her apartment twice, that she had been trying to handle it quietly without escalating to a restraining order because she was afraid of what that would set off in him, and now he was here, in this hallway, and she was alone. "He won't make a scene if I'm not alone," she said, and I could hear the way she had clearly been playing this out in her head the whole drive over. "He's performative. He cares about how things look. If I have someone with me, especially someone he doesn't know, he'll back down. I just need him to see that I've moved on, that there's someone in my life. Please, 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." I looked down the hallway and I saw him before she pointed him out. You know how some people just have an energy that announces itself? Preston was maybe 35, dressed like he had just come from a golf club. arms crossed, leaning against the wall with the particular posture of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and was currently irritated that he was being made to wait. He was watching the classroom doors. He hadn't seen us yet, and Marcus's classroom was right next to Lily's, which meant I was going to be walking right past this man in approximately 90 seconds regardless. So here is where I made the decision. I looked at Claire. I looked at her shaking hands. I thought about the fact that my son was behind one of those doors, and that this woman's daughter was behind another, and that there was a man down that hallway who had no business being there. And I said, "All right, what's your name?" "Claire," she said. "Claire, I'm Daniel. I'm Marcus's dad. Marcus sits next to Lily, I think. Here's what we're going to do. Walk next to me. Don't look nervous. Let me do the talking if it comes to that." She exhaled like she had been holding her breath for 30 minutes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Genuinely, thank you." We walked down that hallway together, and I want to tell you, I have walked into rooms where millions of dollars were on the table. I have sat across from people who were trying to dismantle everything I built. I have given speeches to auditoriums full of industry analysts who were waiting for me to say the wrong thing. But there was something about walking down that elementary school hallway next to a stranger while her ex watched us approach that was oddly one of the more charged moments I can remember. I kept my posture easy. I let my arm brush hers once, naturally, the way you would if you were actually comfortable with someone, and I watched Preston's face as he registered us. His eyes went to Claire first, then to me, then back to Claire. And I saw it, the slight recalibration. The way his chin lifted just a fraction and his arms uncrossed and he stood up straight. Because suddenly the situation was different than he had planned for. Just before we reached the classroom doors, Claire slipped her hand into mine, and I let her. It was calculated and practical, and also, I will be honest with you, my heart rate did a thing I hadn't expected. Preston stepped toward us and said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Claire, didn't know you had plans today." And Claire, to her absolute credit, said with a calmness I deeply respected, "I always pick up Lily on Tuesdays, Preston. You know that." There was a silence. Preston looked at me. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I've learned over the years that silence is one of the most powerful things you can deploy in a tense moment. Preston, who had probably expected to have Claire alone and flustered, did not know what to do with a calm, silent man who was a few inches taller than him and showing no signs of anxiety whatsoever. He said, "And you are?" And I said, "Daniel." Just that, just my name, no elaboration, no explanation, just absolute comfortable certainty. The way you say your name when you have nothing to prove. The classroom doors opened. The children came pouring out. Lily ran to Claire and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, and I watched Claire close her eyes for just a second and hold her daughter like she had been bracing for something terrible all afternoon and was only now allowing herself to feel relieved. Marcus appeared a moment later, crashing into me the way 9-year-olds do, and I caught him and ruffled his hair, and he immediately started telling me about something that happened at lunch. Preston stood there for another moment, recalculating, recalibrating, trying to find a foothold in a situation that had shifted entirely. He looked at Lily. He looked at Claire. He looked at me one more time, and then without another word, he turned and walked back down the hallway and out the front door. Claire let out a long, slow breath. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet, though she blinked it back quickly. "He's gone," she said, like she needed to say it out loud to believe it. "He's actually gone." Now here is the part of the story where I need to pause and ask you directly, because I know some of you are already forming opinions. Some of you are probably thinking that I was playing hero when I should have just walked away and let the school handle it. Some of you might be thinking about the fact that I was holding a stranger's hand while my son was watching. And I want you to pause right now and drop a comment below. What would you have done, seriously? If you were in that hallway, if you saw what I saw, would you have kept walking? Would you have stayed? Because here's the thing. I have asked myself that question 100 times since this happened, and I keep arriving at the same answer. But I want to know what you think before I tell you where this story goes next, because it didn't end in that hallway. Not even close. Claire insisted on thanking me properly. She said it awkwardly, with Lily tugging on her hand, and Marcus bouncing beside me asking if he could have a playdate with Lily, because apparently they had been best friends for months, and I had simply not been informed. I said it was nothing, and I meant it. She said it wasn't nothing, and looking back, she was right. We ended up walking to the parking lot together, the four of us, kids ahead, and somewhere between the front steps and the parking lot, the adrenaline faded, and we just started talking. Normally, like two people who hadn't just staged an emotional counter-operation in an elementary school corridor. She told me she was an architect, that she had been in the middle of a site review when the school called, that she had been dealing with Preston's behavior for 3 months, and had been exhausted by it and embarrassed by it and hadn't told many people. I told her I was a single dad, that Marcus's mom had passed when Marcus was 3, that it had been just the two of us for a long time. She looked at me when I said that with an expression I recognized. Not pity, something more careful than that. Acknowledgement maybe, the kind that comes from someone who also knows what it is to hold things together alone. We exchanged numbers, practically. She said she wanted to be able to thank me properly once the dust settled and she wasn't running on adrenaline and cortisol. I said sure. I didn't think much would come of it. I drove home, helped Marcus with his homework, made dinner, had my nightly call with my operations director about the next morning's board meeting, and went to sleep. Except I didn't really sleep. And the reason I didn't sleep wasn't the board meeting. She texted the next morning. Just a simple message. Lily asked me this morning if Daniel was my boyfriend. I didn't know what to say. Thank you again for real. I stared at that text for longer than I should have before typing back. What did you tell her? She sent back a laughing emoji and then, I told her you were a very kind man who helped us out, she said, and I quote, he looked like a dad boyfriend. I don't know what that means, but I felt I should share it. I laughed out loud in my car, sitting in the parking garage of my own office building, and I realized it had been a while since I had laughed like that before 9 in the morning. My assistant, Renata, who had worked with me for 6 years and knew everything, walked past my car window, looked at me sideways and said, "You're in early, and you're smiling." Should I be concerned? I told her no, I was not certain that was true. Over the next 2 weeks Claire and I texted. At first it was light, she would send something funny, I would respond. Then it got longer. Real conversations that stretched late into evenings after the kids were in bed. She told me about her work, her clients, the project she was most proud of. A community center she had designed pro bono in her 3rd year out of architecture school that was still standing and full of children every afternoon. I told her about the company, which, and here is the part I need to tell you carefully, she still didn't know the full extent of. I hadn't lied to her, I just hadn't elaborated. She knew I worked in logistics, she didn't know I ran the company, she knew I had a busy schedule, she didn't know why. And I want to be clear that this wasn't a game I was playing. I genuinely, deeply valued the fact that she talked to me like a person and not a title, and I wasn't ready to hand that over yet. The moment she found out was not planned by me, and it was not gentle. We had made plans for the 4 of us, me, Marcus, Claire and Lily, to go to a science museum on a Saturday afternoon. It was casual, it was technically not a date. We had both said that explicitly to each other and then laughed about how hard we were working to say it wasn't a date. I was waiting outside the museum entrance when my phone rang. It was my head of investor relations, and the call was urgent. Something about a press release that had gone out early, and a journalist from a financial publication who was asking for a comment. I took the call, I had to, and I was deep in the middle of it, using words like merger timeline and board authorization and quarterly projections, when Claire walked up behind me with the kids, close enough to hear. I saw her face change as she listened, the way her eyes went careful and still. I finished the call, turned around, and she just looked at me and said very quietly, "Logistics, huh?" I said, "Claire." She said, "How big is your company, Daniel?" And I told her all of it, the number of employees, the offices, the revenue last year. The fact that I had been about to walk into a board meeting the same day she asked me to pretend to be her boyfriend. She was quiet for a long moment and I braced myself for anger, or hurt, or the particular cold tone people use when they feel deceived. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I still think about, and she said, "So you were in the middle of everything and you still stopped for us?" It wasn't a question, I said. "Yeah, I did." She nodded slowly like something was settling into place. "Okay," she said, and then she turned to the kids and said brightly, "Who wants to see the space exhibit first?" And that was it, was the whole thing. Except it wasn't the whole thing, because Preston made one more appearance that I haven't told you about yet. About 3 weeks after the museum, he showed up at Claire's apartment building on a weeknight, and this time he wouldn't leave. He sat outside in his car for 2 hours. Claire called me, and I could hear in her voice that she was trying to hold herself together and not quite managing it. I made sure Marcus was settled, called our neighbor Mrs. Okafor to sit with him, and drove over. I walked past Preston's car, knocked on the window, and when he opened it, I told him clearly and without any performance that Claire had someone in her life now, that she was not going to be available to him, and that the next time he showed up somewhere he wasn't wanted, I would be making calls to the building management, to the school to formally remove his contact status on Lily's file, and to anyone else who needed to be notified. Preston looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You're serious?" I said, "I've never been less dramatic about anything in my life." He drove away. He did not come back. Claire opened her apartment door when I came upstairs, and she had clearly been crying, though she was pulling herself back together in real time, the way people do when they've been frightened and are relieved and embarrassed about the fear all at once. I didn't make a big speech. I just said, "You're okay, he's gone." She leaned her head against the doorframe and looked at me and said, "Why are you this good?" And I said, "I don't know, I think my mother raised me right." She laughed, which was what I was hoping for. I want to tell you that what happened between Claire and me in the months that followed was not a dramatic fairy tale. It wasn't fireworks and grand gestures. It was slow and careful and real. The way things are when two adults who have both lost things and protected things and come together with their children in tow. It was coffee at her kitchen table while the kids did homework in the next room. It was her showing up to one of the rare public events I attended and watching her hold her own in a room full of people who tried to figure out who she was relative to me. It was Marcus telling me one morning entirely unprompted, "Dad, I think Lily's mom likes you," and me saying, "Oh yeah? What makes you say that?" And him saying with the crushing confidence of a 9-year-old, "Because she looks at you the way people look at cake." I thought about that for a long time. There is a morning I keep coming back to. It was maybe 5 months after that hallway. We were at the farmer's market, the same Saturday market where I usually bought tomatoes in my gray hoodie, and Marcus and Lily were ahead of us, arguing cheerfully about something, and Claire had her hand in mine. And it was completely unremarkable, which is exactly what made it remarkable. A woman from my building recognized me and stopped to say hello, and she looked at the four of us and said, clearly delighted, "Oh, this must be your family." And neither Claire nor I corrected her. We just smiled, and later in the car Claire looked over at me and said, "Is this the part where we admit this is something?" I said, "I think it has been something for a while." She said, "I know, I just wanted to hear you say it," and I said it. Clearly, out loud. In the farmer's market parking lot, with our kids bickering in the back seat about whose fault it was that they didn't get the honey sticks, I said what I meant. And she said what she meant. And that was the beginning of something that felt, for the first time, in a very long time, like it might actually last, what this story taught me. And I've thought about it more than I expected to. Is that the best things in my life have never arrived through the doors I was standing in front of. The company grew not because of the plan I made but because of a problem I solved for someone I hadn't expected to help. My relationship with Marcus deepened not through the parenting books I read but through the nights I put everything down and just sat with him on the kitchen floor. And Claire? Claire found me because she was desperate and I had a kind face and I chose, in a split second in a school hallway, to stop, not because I was a CEO, not because I was impressive or strategic or powerful, just because I was a person who saw someone who needed help, and I had the capacity to give it, and I did. I think about what would have happened if I had looked at my watch that afternoon and kept walking. And it genuinely unsettles me. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for us in that hallway, and through everything that came after, I want you to like this video. It tells me that you were on our side, and honestly, it means a lot. If you're new here and you want more stories like this one, real and messy and ultimately hopeful, please subscribe because I share these things as often as I can, and I never want you to miss one. And leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done in that hallway. Tell me at what point you would have walked away, or at what point you were fully invested. I read every single comment, and I respond when I can. This community is the reason I keep telling these stories, and I don't take that lightly. Until next time, I'll see you all in the next story.